The taste of these Islay peated whiskies might be about to change. Let's talk about it. Hey guys, welcome back to Whiskey on the West Coast. My name is Matt, and yes, you heard that correctly. The taste of many of your favorite, or possibly your favorite, Islay peated whiskies might be about to change. And that's due to malt shortages at the Diageo-owned Port Ellen Maltings. But now that I have your attention, let's pump the brakes just a little bit. You don't have to go out and panic buy your favorite Islay peated whiskey. Don't go clear the shelves with Ardbeg 10 or Laphroaig 10 or some of the other ones out there. That's not what I'm telling you to do. Whiskey making is a very slow moving process. And on top of that, technically with batch variation, your favorites are already changing just slightly, minutely, each time there's a new batch anyways. So I'm not here to be alarmist. I'm not here to cause a whiskey panic or something of that nature. But what I want to do is I want to understand what's going on with the Port Ellen Maltings and the changes that are coming out of there. And I want to discuss the changes that we might see play out over time with Islay peated whiskies. In the fall of 2022, whispers started to emerge about the potential challenges to the peated malt supply on Islay. And word was that the amount of malt that the Port Ellen Maltings would provide to non-Diageo distilleries would be lessened in a significant amount in 2023. And in 2024, the malt that they supply could actually cease entirely. And this is due to supply capabilities being strained, exhausted due to the huge demand for peated malt whiskey. It's very popular, exceptionally popular, possibly as popular as it's ever been. Now, Master Malt, as well as others, published some great articles covering this last fall. It seems there's a perfect storm that's partly to blame here. The popularity of Islay whiskey, as I mentioned, and peated malt whiskey in general, has just increased demand for it from the distilleries. And the Diageo-owned Kilmore Distillery near Port Ellen by far produces the most whiskey on Islay. Now, it shut down during COVID-19, but it's back to, or at least part of it, but it's back to operating 7 days a week again. And later this year, in December, I believe actually, the Port Ellen Distillery will be resurrected. It will roar back to life. It was closed for quite some time, mothballed, but it's going to roar back to life. And I believe spirit's going to be flowing off the stills this December for the first time since 1983. So where is all of the peated malt for these distilleries going to come from? To add to this perfect storm is the needs of a distillery like Lagavulin for a peated malt from Port Ellen as well as others in the Diageo umbrella. So this is really the point where Diageo had to make the decision of whether to expand the Port Ellen Maltings or to start doing something else. And they decided to do something else, which is to restrict the amount of malt that they are providing to other distilleries. And so this sounds a bit like a matter of supply and a possible problem of scarcity of whiskey. And it seems like a simple answer. We'll just get peated malt from elsewhere. Problem solved. It's not that simple, and it's not just about that. And that's because the ferry system is already faltering under the strain of the resident Ilex, the tourists who visit, and the metric tons of peat and other supplies that have to come over to Islay to make the whiskeys. So the ferry system can't be expected necessary to bring that much more peat across immediately, at least in the short term. I'm sure they can provide long term, but they're already having a lot of infrastructure issues surrounding ferries. Further to this challenge is the fact that other maltsters like Baird's, Crisp, Simpson's are already essentially at their limits for providing malt to other distilleries. And then there's the other problem of, if you're getting malt from these other distilleries, is that malt going to provide a whiskey once distilled that smells and tastes just like the whiskey that's already made on Islay? One of the things that was mentioned at a number of the Islay distilleries that I visited in June was that where the peat comes from, where it's cut from, matters in the taste and the flavor and the aroma of the whiskey. Where that is sourced is very important. There is such a thing as peat terroir. And this is particularly emphasized at Kilchoman when we're looking at the kiln and the peat that was cut from nearby Lochgorm that they use to make their 100% Islay. And in my experience, I'd wholeheartedly agree. Peat terroir does exist, and the barley kilned with peat from one part of Scotland as opposed to another or even another part of the world does make a difference on the whiskey. We won't always necessarily notice, but I think it's discernible. As a broad generalization, and I know the internet loves broad generalizations, but Islay peat, in my experience, is typically more coastal. Oftentimes it can have medicinal notes, and these sorts of things are due to the fact that it's mainly comprised of decayed matter that was made up of things like seaweed, ocean matter, or it was in low-lying areas where seawater was actually able to be soaked up into the vegetation that eventually decayed. So it has these influences naturally from what is actually made of. Highland peat, similarly, often contains more things that were around the highlands, which usually contains more wood and less moss than something like Islay peat. And it can oftentimes produce a smoke profile that's more akin to like a campfire type of smoke, an ashy smoke. As the final example here, and again, there's dozens of examples, but again, broad generalizations, Orkney peat can oftentimes present as a bit lighter, and it has a bit of a floral profile due to the large proportion of heather that's comprised in what makes up Orkney peat. So the malt source for the Port Ellen Maltings is kilned with peat that's harvested from the Castle Hill peat bog on Islay, and that's somewhere near the airport, the Islay airport. Now, what I'm trying to suggest is that regardless of where the barley is malted, if the peat doesn't come from Islay, it might not taste like the Islay whiskeys that you're used to. The flavor could very well or likely change. Now, I have read somewheres online, and I can't confirm this, but the Port Ellen Maltings, when it has had a shortage, sometimes it's actually sourced peat from other parts of Scotland too, to use at their maltings. I can't confirm that, and if so, maybe we can't notice. I'm open to being wrong. If you guys have more information about these sorts of things, let me know in the comments down below, because I'm certainly not an expert in these things. But I have been researching this, I have been digging into it, and I wanted to talk about the distilleries that I think probably won't see a change in their flavor profile, and then I wanted to talk about the distilleries that we may see a change. So let's get to those distilleries. Now, in terms of distilleries that are not going to be impacted, or at least less impacted by these decisions by the Port Ellen Maltings, obviously are the Diageo distilleries. Any distilleries owned by Diageo won't be impacted to as great of an extent with a malt shortage. And so I mentioned some of these earlier, but they'd be distilleries like Lagavulin, Kalila, the soon-to-be reopened Port Ellen Distillery. This also extends to, I believe, and I could be wrong, but the Talisker Distillery, I believe, uses Port Ellen Maltings as well for their peated malt. So these 4 distilleries, 3 of which are on Islay, 1 on the Isle of Skye, these ones should be fine for their peated malt supply, as opposed to some of the others on Islay. When I visited the town of Bowmore, I absolutely had to visit the Bowmore Distillery, and when I did, I was really excited to visit the #1 vaults, because that is just simply put a magical place where magical whiskey lives. I was just thrilled to be able to draw whiskey from those casks. But another thing I really loved about visiting Bowmore was the fact that they have their own malting floors. Now, they are one of 3, soon to be 4 distilleries on Islay that has their own malting floors, which is actually really interesting, because there's only about roughly 10 or so distilleries in Scotland that have their own malting floors that can provide their own malted barley. So that's really, really interesting. Now, their malting floors were actually silent at the time because they were in the midst of what seems like an annual drought on Islay, where they weren't able to draw water from their water source, the River Lagavulin. It was just too low at the time. But when they do go ahead and provide their own barley from their own malting floors, they dry it in their using their kiln, and they use peat that's cut from near the Islay airport. Now, this is also near the Castle Hill peat bog. I'm not sure, it could even be next door, adjacent, or possibly even the same source. All I know is it's near the airport, according to our tour guide. So that's really interesting. They are using Islay peat to actually go ahead and malt their barley. Now, they're only able to, unfortunately, provide about 30 to 40% of their peated malt needs for their distillery. It's a very large distillery, that's understandable. But whatever else they source, according to my tour guide, they source from the mainland. She didn't mention a particular maltster, or if it was peated malt, or if they're blending unpeated malt in with the already peated malt that they provide. She didn't get into those details. But what I do know is if it's coming from the mainland, that would mean, as far as I'm aware, that they're not sourcing it from the Port Ellen Maltings, which would mean the Bowmore Distillery, there shouldn't be any changes to the whiskey coming out of there because of the decisions being made by the Port Ellen Maltings. So Bowmore shouldn't be changing as far as I'm aware. On top of these distilleries, Bruichladdich also is sitting in a pretty decent position because they aren't reliant on the Port Ellen Maltings for their peated malt. As it stands right now, they're currently using Baird's Maltings in, I believe, the Highlands for their peated malt. Now, this means the smell and the taste of things like Port Charlotte or on top of that, Octomore, these shouldn't be impacted by any changes happening at the Port Ellen Maltings. Now, Bruichladdich does have plans to build their own malting floors so that they can do every step of the process on site at Bruichladdich. But these plans were delayed by COVID-19. Now let's get to the crux of this video, the distilleries that may be impacted by this Port Ellen malting shortage. So the first one I want to talk about is the Ardbeg Distillery. Now, as far as I'm aware, Ardbeg sources 100% of its peated malt from the Port Ellen Maltings. And what this would mean, and it's peated to 50 phenol parts per million, in case you're wondering. Now, Port Ellen, will they continue to provide the current supply required by Ardbeg to that distillery? That's a complicated matter, because they announced that, again, all these non-Diageo owned distilleries will be have their supplies cut in 2023 and possibly stopped altogether in 2024. But Ardbeg's a special case because their parent company, LVMH, Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy, I believe is part owned, like 34% owned by Diageo, unless they've divested that stake. I'm not sure. But if so, I feel like Diageo would have some interest in continuing to provide peated malt to Ardbeg. However, from what I'm hearing, that's not exactly what has happened. I've heard that, again, this part's a rumor, so don't take this as gospel truth, but what I've heard is that they're actually running malt that's been sourced from the Glen Ord Maltings. And this is unpeated malt. We are seeing a return to unpeated Ardbeg. And we've had that in the past. I haven't had the chance to try it. I'd love to try unpeated Ardbeg. But are they going to release this as official bottlings from Ardbeg that are unpeated once again? Is this going to be something that's sold off to blends or to independent bottlers? Who knows? But if the rumor's true, we have unpeated Ardbeg being made once again, which is really interesting because, of course, they want to keep the distillery running so that they can keep people employed in their jobs and the distillery making money. Now, back to the peated malt for a moment. If they truly do stop providing peated malt to Ardbeg from Port Ellen, where's Ardbeg going to source it from if they need that peated malt? I mean, we need our Ardbeg. Is it going to be from the mainland? If so, are they going to ship peat from Islay to that mainland maltster to go ahead and dry that barley in the kiln? Or are they going to use mainland sourced peat? And is that going to change the flavor profile with, again, what we talked about earlier with the possibilities of peat terroir? It'll be really interesting to find out. And I'm not sure what's going to happen here, but I know that we're going to be able to smell and taste it possibly in the future. Next distillery I want to talk about is the Kilchoman Distillery. Now, this distillery is a farm distillery that grows a lot of its own barley that it uses for its whiskey in the fields surrounding the distillery. I think it's harvest time right now. They might be harvesting that crop as we speak. And on top of that, they have a malting floor which they use to malt their own barley at the distillery. And the kiln that they use there to dry it, they use peat that's been cut from the nearby Loch Gorm to fire that kiln. And Loch Gorm's just down the road from the distillery. So you would think, hearing all of this, that Kilchoman wouldn't be impacted by a shortage in peated malt from Port Ellen. Not necessarily. So here's the deal. The barley that they floor malt at Kilchoman themselves is used for their 100% Islay expressions. And that's both their annual releases. I think they've done 12 so far, but also their 100% Islay single casks. Now, if you've had these whiskeys, you also know that they're fairly low in phenol count. They're about 20 phenol parts per million. And if you're familiar with the regular core range from Kilchoman, like Saneg, Macquarie Bay, you'd know that they're much heavier peated. They're usually about 50 phenol parts per million. If that 50 sounds familiar, that's because this is the same number, again, that Ardbeg used for their phenol counts. And that's because they're both sourcing this peated malt, as far as I know, from the Port Ellen Maltings. So yes, Kilchoman would be affected by any cutbacks, any reductions, or any ceasing of supply from the Port Ellen Maltings for peated malt. Now, I asked our tour guide, what's the plan? What are you guys thinking you're going to do about this? And to be fair, I shouldn't expect tour guides necessarily to have the answers to these sorts of questions. However, they speculated that they would be needing to source peat from the peated malt from the mainland. Now, there's no word if they would be sending, again, Islay cut peat to the mainland, to those maltsters, to be used to create that peated malt, or if it would be from another source. Now, recently, if you listen to One Nation Under Whisky, the Single Cask Nation podcast with Joshua Hatton, he actually mentioned, because he has ties to the brand Kilchoman, I believe he's part of the importing group that brings it into North America, at least the United States. And it sounded to me from what he was saying that they're looking at expanding their malting floors to accommodate the amount of malt that they require. However, if they're looking to do that, that's going to take quite a bit of time, and I don't think that would be ready to solve the problem for them in 2024. So it'd be interesting to see if the flavor profile for Kilchoman does change as a result of having to change where they source a good quantity of their peated malt. As far as I understand, as it is right now, they're only able to provide about 30% of the malt that they require for their distillery from their own malting floor. We'll see what the future has in store in that regard for Kilchoman. Laphroaig is the final distillery I'm going to talk about here on Islay that has its own floor maltings to produce some of its peated malt needs. Now, the peat that they use to go ahead and make this peated malt is actually cut from the field right across the road from the distillery. It's actually their own peat fields. They own it. And if you're a friend of Laphroaig, you know that you can actually have your own square foot of peat bog in Scotland through joining Friends of Laphroaig, and you can claim your own rent on that 1 square foot of Scotland of peat bog by visiting the distillery and claiming that, and they'll give you a dram of Laphroaig. It's really cool, but they are only able to provide a portion, a large portion, but a portion of their peated malt needs a year, because Laphroaig makes an astounding amount of whiskey every year, so they have to provide for that surplus from somewhere else. The rest of that peated malt, once again, comes from, and this is, you're going to see a trend here, from the Port Ellen Maltings. A lot of distilleries are really relying on the Port Ellen Maltings for this peated malt. Now, mitigation plans to deal with this involve adding an additional malting floor per week at Laphroaig. So I'm guessing that means either staff working longer hours or hiring more staff to run the malting floors 24 hours a day. I'm not really sure what that looks like for them, because I thought that was a space issue. Either way, our guide said they're going to be adding a malting floor. Great. But the rest of that malt that they need is going to have to come from somewhere. I'm guessing it's going to come from mainland maltsters. So the same questions apply here. Where is the peat coming from? Are we going to be able to taste a difference in peat terroir? If they're blending them, maybe not. Maybe it'll just taste like regular Laphroaig. But these are questions that we don't have answers to. Further to this, the same rumor that I had read about before in regards to Ardbeg running unpeated malt also applies to Laphroaig. Apparently Laphroaig is doing some unpeated runs right now, and they're apparently sourcing that unpeated malt from the Glenord Maltings as well. I'd love to try some unpeated Laphroaig. Apparently this is, again, set to go to blends. Maybe some independent bottlers will get their hands on some of it, and we might see some of it in the market one day. But these are questions we're not going to have answers to for quite some time. In either event, it'll be interesting to see what happens for Laphroaig and where they go ahead and source their peated malt from here on out. Next up, we have to talk about Bunnahabhain. Now, classic Bunnahabhain. Bunnahabhain's known for unpeated whiskey. However, got a thing for peated Bunnahabhain? Stoisha or Moyne releases? I do. I love peated Bunnahabhain. It's delicious. However, whether it's Moyne or Stoisha, either way, my understanding is that the peated malt for those releases comes from, once again, the Port Ellen Maltings. This is yet another distillery that needs to come up with an alternative source of peated malt. You can see how this is putting a lot more strain on these mainland maltsters. If all these other places, like distilleries in the Highland that weren't traditionally using peat, but now are. On top of that, you now have Islay distilleries that traditionally use it that are looking for new sources of peated malt as well. You can see how this is going to lead to a lot of operational constraints for other maltsters outside of Port Ellen. Now, this is not an exclusively Islay distillery problem. This is also a problem for distilleries that aren't on Islay, like the Bowmore Distillery on the Isle of Mull. Bowmore is known for their unpeated Bowmore whiskey, but they're also known for their increasingly popular peated whiskey, Laphroaig. Laphroaig is peated to around 35 phenol parts per million. And again, it's a whiskey I really love and enjoy. And Bowmore is a distillery that's owned by the same company that owns Bunnahabhain. And they also source, to my knowledge, their peated malt from the same place that they use to source the peated malt for Bunnahabhain, which, broken record here, is the Port Ellen Maltings. So 100% of their peated malt comes from there as far as I'm aware. And once again, if they change their peated malt provider, does that mean that they're changing to a Highland peat source or something else? Or are they going to provide the peat to that maltings to try and keep that characteristic, that type of peat terroir from Islay? Or is it going to be something else altogether? I really don't know. And this is just something that we're going to have answered to us by the distillery if they ever want to talk about it. Or we're just going to have to find out when the whiskey finally comes out in 10 years, I guess. If we see Laphroaig 10 or if we try some independent bottlers that come out sooner. Now, before you go out and panic buy a Laphroaig 10 or Laphroaig 10 cask strength, which is what I got in my glass here, it's absolutely delicious. If you haven't had it, go find some. Let's talk about why you should pump the brakes on any whiskey alarmism and why you don't need to go out and start panic buying and hoarding these Islay peated whiskeys. As far as I'm aware, the Port Ellen Maltings hasn't actually cut off any distilleries entirely yet. They just reduced supply because of their own shortages, and they gave them about a year heads up. Now, with this being the case, that means that they also could have a change in business practice. They could say maybe change their minds and actually follow through with an expansion in the maltings to provide more malt altogether. Now, that would probably take a couple years to build, but that would mean this is just a temporary difference in these whiskeys potentially. Perhaps they find some other solution that I'm just not aware of. I'm not an expert in these matters. There could be some other solution out there that hasn't been brought to the table yet. So I'm not panicking yet because nothing is set in stone. Furthermore, a peat source, where you get your peat. I believe you can taste peat terroir, however, it is still a small but important portion of the full equation that leads to our whiskey tasting the way it does. The amount of difference will vary from barely perceptible to very noticeable, depending on what you're drinking, especially if they used Port Ellen malt with a blend of their own malted barley, like Laphroaig and Bowmore do, I believe. I believe they're cutting in their own floor malted barley in with the others, or they're blending those whiskeys together in a vatting. So again, it's not something necessarily you're going to perceive. So I don't think there's a need to panic about the differences. Now, you might find a difference in a single cask of Laphroaig or Bowmore, but single casks are already so unique. I think that's just going to add to the interest factor on that whiskey as opposed to take away. Now, if we're going to be talking about a change in the flavor profile of these Islay whiskeys, it's going to happen slowly. So again, there's no reason to rush out and buy these whiskeys at the moment. If we're talking about how soon we could see this change, well, let's think about some of the core ranges of these distilleries that might see a change. If we're looking at Ardbeg, the youngest whiskey in their core range is the Ardbeg Wee Beastie, which is 5 years old. So the change actually manifesting in our whiskey is at least 5 years away in that case. If we're talking about independent bottles or like secret Islay whiskeys, say if they were as young as 3 years old, it's still going to be 3 years before we see any differences if they're going to arise at all. So again, whiskey takes a lot of time to make. This isn't going to be something that's going to happen suddenly. It's going to happen slowly, and we're going to have time to prepare. There's plenty of potential solutions to these problems too in sourcing peated malt. One of the solutions, though costly and would take a lot of logistical support, is, again, as we've mentioned throughout this video, the mainland maltsters using peat that's been sourced from Islay to help kind of keep that peat terroir intact. It's not going to be identical to the processes they used at the Port Ellen Maltings for the amount of time it's on wet peat versus dry peat, how long they smoke it, these sorts of things. But by using peat that does come from Islay, perhaps it'll keep it closer to its character, if we would even perceive a difference at all. On top of this, another solution is potentially using something like a drum maltings, which is just a much more efficient way to go ahead and malt the barley for the whiskey. I don't believe any of the distilleries in Islay are using these yet, but that's something that they should consider. I think the Springbank Mitchell Group is considering this for the Kilchoman Glengyle Distillery right now. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Lastly, I've only claimed that the smell and taste could potentially change, not that it could change for the better or the worse. Like, think about that. Maybe the whiskey will actually taste better after these changes as opposed to worse. Now, I find that highly unlikely because I like these whiskeys as they are. However, I can't discount the possibility that there could actually be an improvement in quality by changing up the malt source as opposed to relying so heavily on the Port Ellen Maltings. On top of this, distillers are experts in their crafts. They know how to get the whiskey to taste the way they want by changing cut points, by changing the way they run their stills, how fast, how slow, these sorts of things. I'm not going to discount the expertise of these professionals, these masters of their craft. I'm sure they can work wonders to make the whiskey taste extremely close, if not identical, to what it tasted like before. Again, we're not going to have answers to these questions until the distilleries tell us, and until we actually get our hands on the whiskey that's been made with malt aside from Port Ellen Maltings. So my question for you guys at this point is, do you think you're going to be able to taste a difference in this whiskey 5 years, 10 years down the line when we finally get our hands on this distillate that's going to be made with peated malt that's not been made at the Port Ellen Maltings? Comment down below if you think there will be a noticeable difference in any way. And if so, what's the one whiskey you hope doesn't change over the ones I mentioned that might? Or is there one that you're actually looking forward to a change of, you haven't enjoyed, and you think, hey, maybe this change in malt source might make it better? Comment down below, let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching so far into this video. Thank you for sticking with it. I hope to provide more videos like this that are diving into these sorts of topics. If I find out more information, I might double back and give you an update to this video. I feel like that would be a good thing to do if we find out more about what's actually being done at these distilleries. But once again, thank you for joining me. If you can like, share, and subscribe if you haven't done already, I really appreciate it. And please come back for more in the future. Until next time, from the West Coast, Slàinte.